Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. How do you scoop up a discounted real estate deal at a property foreclosure auction? We're talking with an expert that's bought hundreds of properties this way. Learn some fatal mistakes that you must avoid so that you don't overpay and that you don't mistakenly buy into a deep money pit. What happens at a foreclosure auction? Today on Get Rich Education. The people that our listeners can't stop talking about are Ridge Lending Group and MLS 42056. They provided you with more loans than anyone. It's where I got my last few loans, and they finance single-family income property up to fourplexes. They're the number one lender for both beginners and veterans. Start your pre-qualification, chat with President Chaley Ridge personally, and you'll end up with your custom plan for expanding your cash-flowing portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold, this is Get Rich Education, and thanks for being here. But as always, you're not here for me, you're here for you. What's it like to attend a property foreclosure auction? These properties become available when, sadly, a borrower defaults on their mortgage payments or their other payments for several months, and their property is in the process of being repossessed. We're going to talk about what that scene looks like. You might imagine a bunch of bidders on the courthouse steps and an auctioneer with a bullhorn or a microphone at the top of the stairs. Are bidders holding up wooden paddles with numbers on them at these foreclosure auctions? We'll discuss foreclosure auctions later, but first, people are buying houses like crazy today with this low supply, high demand, and interest rates at levels below the ocean floor. Now that homes have also become people's home schools and home offices and home gyms. Well, one measure about how this has pushed up housing values was just released by CoreLogic. They say that in the past year, homeowners with mortgages represent about 63% of all properties. Okay, that is then that about 5 in 8 homeowners have mortgages. Well, this group, they've seen their equity increase by nearly 11%. This equates to a collective $1 trillion in gained equity. Okay, that sounds impressive, but that's a big number. So what does that really mean in relative terms? That is an average gain of about $17,000 per homeowner. And CoreLogic goes on to tell us that the average family with a home mortgage loan had $194,000 in home equity last quarter. And for a lot of people, this can stimulate their wealth effect. That's the end of what CoreLogic said for a moment here, where this is me talking. The wealth effect, it's that psychological effect when people feel wealthier. It makes them want to spend more as a consumer in the economy. CoreLogic went on to finish saying that as it stands now, the share of borrowers that have a negative equity position, that means those people that owe more on their mortgages than the home is actually worth, that proportion is down to just 3%. Okay, 3% of borrowers are in a negative equity position, and that's not a good position for those people to be in if they're also in that group that could lose their homes once the foreclosure moratorium ends. Now, I've got something rather surprising to share with you in setting this up. Okay, year over year home price appreciation, that's going to vary based on how your source compiles their numbers. Right now, Freddie Mac will tell you that home prices are up 9.7% year over year. Now, you'll remember that 3 weeks ago here on the show, in our episode named Booming Home Price Appreciation and Record Prices, I emphasized then how people don't buy property based on its price, but rather they buy based on if they think they can afford the monthly payments, something that the mortgage interest rate has a big influence on. Then when you look at nominal price gains, like this 9.7% that Freddie Mac is telling us about year over year, you also have to factor in the rate of inflation and the affordability. And affordability, that accounts for what wages and salaries are doing. Well, I told you a few weeks ago that I'd like to do some research to help you factor that in, and I always like to follow up and do what I told you I would. First American Financial Corporation, yes, the same well-known title company that you probably heard of, well, they have compiled what they call the Real Housing Price Index, and they have quantified the amount that real home prices have actually changed in the last 20 years. They've dropped, and it really is astounding with how much they've dropped. Factoring in how much housing costs you on a monthly basis, this is accounting for inflation, mortgage rates, and affordability. Here is the difference on your consumer buying power adjusted basis. Houses are more affordable than they've been in over a generation. Since January of 2000, real house prices are down 26.8%. I've talked about how house prices are below their 2006 peak on a real adjusted basis, and yeah, down 26.8% since 2000. That is pretty remarkable. So then, if you adjust today's housing prices to the 2006 peak, not the beginning of the year 2000, but the 2006 peak, they'd probably be even lower than down 26.8%. Really astonishing when you look at it. And I connect you with resources like this Real House Price Index and more through our Don't Quit Your Daydream letter. You can get that at getricheducation.com/letter for that and other resources like it. Real insights directly from me, whiteboard videos that I sometimes create for you, interactive real estate maps, and more. I deliver all of that through email, and these are sent out about weekly, not daily. You can sign up for free at getricheducation.com/letter. Now, at times, it's interesting to get high level and analyze these decisions that, say, Fed Chair Jerome Powell makes while he's standing at a lectern in a room full of well-dressed people, looking down through those half glasses of his, and he tells you he's going to tweak interest rates 1/4 of a point. Well, we're coming from a different place on today's show. Where does that value really get created? One way is when an opportunist buys a distressed property at a discount at a foreclosure auction, and then they fix it up and they sell it. This might sound a little trite to those that do this, but these people have a profit motive to really improve America one house at a time. And this is the birth of how a fix and flipper turns a distressed property into what you might think of as a turnkey property. So what you get the ability to do is leverage a specialist in a local market to use their knowledge and time and skill and connections to identify a distressed property and make this ugly and dysfunctional property into something that's appealing and habitable and maybe even a little bit pretty for you or your tenant. I expect that we're going to learn about some painful experiences here, some auction failures. But the reason that you want to invest through seasoned pros isn't because you want to invest with someone who's never lost. It's so that you can hitch your wagon to the experience of their failures. That's really what you want to do, because you might be a busy professional that can leverage the expertise of the foreclosure auction bidder and everything that they do thereafter. That bidder needs to come to the auction ready to pay cash, because banks won't lend a same-day loan to people for a property that's in disrepair. And you know something? I will very much be learning along with you here today, because I sure don't have any experience at property foreclosure auctions myself. How do the auctions work? Today, you get the backstory of these rehabbed, tenanted properties that you usually only see when they're finished, straight ahead on Get Rich Education. Congress just made it possible to get up to $100,000 out of your current 401k or TSP to invest in real estate, gold, or even your own business. That's even if you're still working, and avoid the IRA UBIT tax. The thing is, you can get your money tax and penalty free for a limited time. The EQRP is your secret weapon. With the CARES Act expiring soon, the EQRP company helps you unleash your retirement funds now. Learn more and text message EQRP in all capital letters to 72,000. Most rental property investors choose either positive cash flow or home price appreciation, but one real estate market can provide both. Jacksonville, Florida, with 9% lower home prices than the national median, 1% higher gross rents, and Jacksonville has appreciated 34% more than other comparable cash flow markets since 1991. Get positive cash flow today and appreciation for tomorrow. To invest for cash flow and growth in Jacksonville, go to cashflowandgrowth.com.
This is Hal Elrod, author of The Miracle Morning, and listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, and don't quit your daydream.
Originally from Ireland, this week's guest has been investing in U.S. real estate since 2009, and he's now bought and sold over $100 million worth of real estate. He used to work with a turnkey provider. In fact, he shared the stage with me last year for our Get Rich Education Tampa real estate field trip. He's done more than 350 fix and flips in the Tampa Bay area. So therefore, among other expertise, he's an acknowledged expert in what we're going to discuss today, and that is trying to buy a deeply discounted property at the foreclosure auctions. Welcome back to Get Rich Education, Colin Murphy.
It's a pleasure to be here, Keith. Thank you.
Now, you've bought several hundred properties in the foreclosure auctions with this intent to fix them up and sell them to investors, which is really the life cycle of a turnkey property. And that property's backstory really is the fact that it often starts out as a foreclosure property, meaning that a borrower, that former property occupant, has defaulted on their mortgage payments or maybe defaulted on their property tax payments. So tell us more about how properties end up in foreclosure here, the genesis of this process.
As you said, it always starts with somebody defaulting on their mortgage, missing enough mortgage payments. And most banks generally won't do anything until borrowers about 3 to 6 months delinquent on their mortgage, because it's just so expensive to go through the foreclosure process. But once you start getting those 3 to 6 months missed payments, a bank will start taking action, start sending you those letters. Eventually that lead to what's called a lis pendens, which is kind of a warning that a foreclosure is in the process of happening. But it's a very slow process. It varies from state to state, even county to county, and it can take years for someone to actually be foreclosed on, and then another month or two after that to actually be forced to leave their home. So it's easier to buy vacant foreclosure houses than occupied foreclosure houses, but there are a lot of investors out there that buy property this way. I mean, you can buy them from wholesalers, you can buy them on the MLS, you can send postcards to distressed sellers. But, you know, I found foreclosure to be a fantastic way of buying real estate over the years.
Of course, be feeling some sympathy for the borrower that has lost their home. So maybe that property is still occupied and maybe it's not occupied at the time it hits the foreclosure auction block. And then I'm thinking physically about the property. I think we're thinking about in our mind's eye about things like boarded up windows, tall weeds in the lawn. So tell us more about the occupancy status and then physically what the property's like.
I mean, you really get a bit of everything. A lot of them are vacant. In a lot of cases, somebody passed away with natural causes. Their heirs might be out of state, didn't have any interest in serving the mortgage, just let it go astray and just ignored the warning letters and the bank letters and just didn't have any interest in this little house in Tampa or wherever it might have been. That happens a lot. Other times it is investors who bought lots of properties and then the 2008 or 9 crisis hit and they're unable to service all these mortgages because the rents went down or tenants stopped paying and they were foreclosed on because they didn't service their mortgages. And then often you do have sad cases where owner occupiers are just falling on hard times. The D's have a lot to do with it: death, divorce, drugs and debt. They're the kind of 4 main items that cause a foreclosure. And while you do definitely have sympathy for them, I personally have never felt guilty bidding on these properties. I mean, the people, they default on their debt through their fault or not, and it's the bank that is foreclosing the property. The bank is getting an order enabling them to foreclose on the property. And if a third party investor like me doesn't buy it, it'll just go back to the bank and they'll list it on the MLS with a realtor. Eventually, it'll get sold and taken off the previous owner either way, whether investors do something or not.
All right. Well, before we talk about the auctions and any of the bidding excitement there, we think about a couple things. There are the ways that lenders need to behave with foreclosed upon properties, whether the state is a judicial state or a non-judicial state. Tell us more about that.
First of all, every state treats foreclosures slightly differently. So it really is state by state, but there is a broad definition into judicial and non-judicial states. And the kind of simple explanation is that a judicial foreclosure means that the lender has to go to court to get a judgment to foreclose on your home. So it can take a long time. It can take 2 or 3 years, while a non-judicial foreclosure means that the lender doesn't need to go to court to get an order to foreclose on the home. So it can be a lot quicker. And, to give you some examples, Florida and New York are judicial. So these are slow moving foreclosure markets. It can take a long time to get foreclosed on. Whereas most of the West Coast of the United States is non-judicial, like California and Washington and Texas, Alaska as well. It depends. I mean, the red judicial states will be, Florida, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, a lot of places on the South and Northeast coasts, whereas probably most states are non-judicial. You got to know which way it is. And then again, you got to drill into what your specific state does. And it's easier to talk to people that have done it before diving in.
Whether a state is judicial or non-judicial, that makes me think about the lender risk when they make the loan in the first place. New York and Florida, they're two examples of judicial states where the foreclosure process can take years, which seems to mean there would be more risk for the lender than non-judicial states like California and Texas, where you can get the property turned over in a matter of months rather than years. So it seems to me like mortgage interest rates then could very well be higher for judicial states like New York and Florida, but I don't know that that's the case.
That's a very interesting point, and you're completely right that people defaulting on their mortgages in Florida are more expensive to deal with than people defaulting on their mortgages in Texas. That is absolutely true, but I don't think that they adjust their mortgage interest rates for that. It's a competitive mortgage market, and they all have strict lending criteria these days. That they're not as careless about lending to people as they were in the mid to late 2005 to 2006 period. But you're absolutely right. It is probably slightly riskier, but the percentage of all mortgages at default is very low nowadays. It's well under 5%. So it's not a high amount, and banks will get their money back eventually. They will tack on all that interest. They will tack on all those legal fees that they have to pay in the judicial state. So as long as there's some equity in the home, which there tends to be nowadays after a 10 or 11 year boom, they'll get their money one way or the other. They lost a lot of money in the properties that they did foreclose on in 2012, 13, 14, 15. They really took a bath on them. But nowadays, they're getting their money back one way or the other.
Yeah, it seems to me when that loan is first made to a borrower, there could very well be a risk premium priced in for the judicial states and therefore a discount for the non-judicial. But in any case, let's talk more about what really happens at these foreclosure auctions when a borrower can no longer make their payments to the bank. And I think a lot of times in our mind's eye, we still think about, is that something that takes place on the courthouse steps, these foreclosure auctions? I don't have any idea myself. I've never attended one. I imagine most of our audience hasn't. So tell us more about the foreclosure auction itself.
I think that's the picture people have, that you put on an overcoat and go to this large courthouse steps and hold up your hand saying 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. It's generally not like that in most places. I mean, but it was until pretty recently. I mean, in Florida, for example, almost all foreclosure auctions, which are county by county. I mean, you're foreclosing in a specific county. So most counties in Florida, not all of them, there's some rural counties that are still, you have to go to courthouse steps, but the majority of places, and certainly the ones all around Tampa Bay where I'm based, are online. That was a game changer. That happened around 2015, 2016, which was just when I started buying in foreclosure auctions. And the huge difference was when they were on the courthouse steps, you literally have to go there with your cashier's checks. And you might have your eye on 2 or 3 properties, and you might only have enough money to buy 1 or to buy 2. And people generally went with different denominations of cashier's checks. So your budget might be $200,000, but you might have a bunch of cashier's checks in 50s, 20s, and 10s because you had to give the clerk the amount of money then and there, and you would get your change back like 3 weeks later. So you don't want to give them a 200,000 cashier's check if you bought a property for 170, because you won't get your money back for, like a month. So,
That's
and also,
wild. You might want to have
yeah,
all
it
these
is.
increments ready. The more increments you have ready, the less likely it is you're going to have to wait for your change weeks later.
And it's still like that in Texas, by the way, which is has a huge state with a huge amount of foreclosure. You still have to turn up at the courthouse steps with your cashier's checks, and you're really limited on bidding in different counties because the courthouse from one county to another, you might be an hour's drive from one to the other. So you might, if it's online, I can bid on an auction in Hillsborough County at 10 a.m. and then one in Pasco County at 11 a.m. I'm literally just at my desk bidding on it. And you could be, I did this while I was overseas, based in Madrid, Spain for many years, bidding on properties in counties throughout Tampa, which you couldn't do that 3 years ago. It was a huge amount of huge difference. So now that was a godsend for people like me that were based overseas at the time, where you could bid on properties. And if you're the highest bidder, you can just wire the exact amount that is needed for it. You don't have to be going to the bank branch to get your cashier's checks and all that kind of stuff. So it was a game changer, and it enabled people all over the country and all over the world to bid on these online auctions. You literally just create an account and deposit money in escrow with the local county. You needed at least 5%, generally speaking, of the amount you're trying to bid. So if you want to bid $100,000 on a property, you need to have a $5,000 deposit in there. If you have a $4,000 deposit, the most you can bid is $80,000, for example. So you need that in there. They'll take that off you straight away if you're the highest bidder. And in most counties in Tampa, you need to pay the balance the same day, literally by 4 p.m. the same day. So if you win the property at auction, you have to pay for the entire property that day, 5% in the morning and the other 95% generally 5 or 6 hours later. And then you need to wait 2 or 3 weeks usually to get your certificate of title. So it's very different to a normal property transaction.
So you need to make a 5% deposit, pay 95%, therefore the balance by the close of business. And how does the bidding work? Does everyone have so many minutes?
The properties are in the list and it goes by order. So it does one property, somebody wins it, then it goes to the next property and it's on the clock. There's 2 minutes for each property. So it literally start 159, 158, and you can submit your bids in advance if you want, and then you can increase them or tweak them while you're there. All you know at the time is what the highest bid is, and you just try and increase. If you can bid more, you just press a button and bid more. And if somebody increases their bid during the last minute in the 2-minute auction, it will increase the time by another minute. So even though it's 2 minutes per property, if it's a very competitive bidding situation, you can drag on for 15, 20 minutes. Once there's a highest bid, the 2-minute clock will start on the next property. And, sometimes the bank will have a minimum bid amount that's too high for any investor to be interested. So that clock will just run down to zero without any third-party bids. Imagine, for example, somebody had a $200,000 judgment on a property that's worth 120, but the bank still wants 170. Well, nobody's going to bid 170, so the bank will just take that back. And, if you're looking for a lot of well thought through logic in which properties the bank decides a reasonable bid amount and which ones they don't, you're not going to find it. It's very ad hoc. You just have to look for the properties that you're interested in, do your homework and log on and see if you can get lucky and be the highest bidder. You go to other auction sites like auction.com or Hubzu or Hudson and Marshall, they all have their own ways of doing it. I mean, in auction.com, if you bid 180,000, it's going to show 180,000. It's not going to go $100 higher than the second bid. So again, you need to know these little things. I do like putting in my strongest bid straight away so that it's you have other people just trying to chase you and they might never get to you, because when you're the highest bidder, the screen goes green. And I'm sure there's some little dopamine reaction in your brain when you see that green screen, and you just get a little bit more aggressive to get back the green screen. If somebody outbids you, you'll keep increasing it in $100 and $500 increments. Whereas if I try and keep the clock red as long as possible just to discourage people from seeing that green screen, there's a whole other world out there. You do need to control yourself and control your emotions, and you do need to have your amount. I'm not bidding more than 120. And maybe you give yourself permission to go $500 or $1,000 higher, but you need to be careful. It is easy to lose the run of yourself and overpay for a property in those situations.
That's interesting. There's got to be a lot of psychology and emotion that plays into that for sure. And then you're making out the payment to the county, and then the county disperses that where?
Yeah, you're making it to county. The county will disperse it to the lender, And if there's anything left over, other lenders, like maybe a second mortgage or a credit card company or something like that, or
A mechanic's lien or a property tax payment or...
yep, they can all submit form to the local county to apply for that excess, as indeed can the borrowers. If you default on a $90,000 debt, but somebody paid $150 for the property, you can go and apply for that excess as well. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize that and don't do it. And the money will just sit. You have a certain amount of time to claim it. I think it's up to 6 months for a borrower and a little bit less for other creditors. But if you don't do it, the county's going to end up keeping it, and God knows what they use it for.
That's got to be really thrilling. That's some important scoreboard watching when you're in the middle of an auction there. And part of that is, how do you know how much to bid? Therefore, you need to get a certain feel for what's in that property and what you need to estimate for renovation costs before you know what to bid in the first place. So tell us more about how you know how high to bid.
You do, and that's where there's a lot of guessing involved, unfortunately, because if you see a property that's coming up for auction next week and you drive by it and it's occupied, most people won't approach that home. You can't really knock on the door and say, can I see your house is coming up for auction? I mean, you probably won't. These people are going through a lot of emotional distress at the time. I mean, yeah. I do know people that knock on doors and say, your property's coming up for auction. I'm very sorry about it, but here's $100 cash if you let me walk through your house. I think they're very brave. I personally haven't been brave enough to do that. You just look at the exterior of the property. That generally gives you a very good insight into the interior. So if the exterior is, if the lawn is trim, if there's a nice car on the driveway, if there isn't a bunch of debris lying around, if it's not overgrown, you can generally make some assumptions about the inside. You can also look up permit information online to see how old the roof is, to see how old the AC is. If you're a realtor or if you've access to the MLS, you can look up the recent sales history. Maybe it was sold 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago. So you can see some interior pictures from there. You might see that there's tile flooring. You might see that the kitchen cabinets look newer. You can see a bunch of stuff generally from that information. But generally, in my experience, you need to assume the worst if you can. Sometimes houses are vacant, but they're just the blinds are closed and the doors are locked and you just can't get in. And you just assume they need everything. Just assume they need new floors, fresh coat of paint, new kitchen, new bathroom, new lights and fans and interior doors and water heaters and everything. I mean, you can kind of see the roof and AC yourself, but certainly been unpleasantly surprised far more often than I've been pleasantly surprised. I mean, maybe one time in 50, you'll buy a house and you'll get into it a few weeks later and you say, oh, wow, this house is much nicer than I thought. These kitchen cabinets are perfect. I don't need to do a thing. But generally speaking, if you assume it needs everything and you walk in, it does. They're generally quite messy and neglected. And some of them have been empty for several years. As an investor, you need to know how much it's going to cost you to put in a new kitchen, how much it's going to cost you to install those floors and bathrooms. And, I'd renovated a lot of similar houses in those neighborhoods, a lot of those concrete block 1970s houses, 1,200 to 1,400 square foot. I had those numbers pretty down, and you can just make some assumptions based on what's needed for one that you can't see inside.
All right, so you need a great understanding of your typical renovation costs. You can do some due diligence on permits and title in addition to just driving by the property before knowing how much to bid.
You don't get title insurance on these properties, so you do need to do your research on the title. You do need to make any liens that are with that property. A lot of them will stay with the property after you buy it. There might be unpaid utility bills. There might be county liens for having an overgrown garden. There might be additional mortgages that weren't foreclosed on property. So you really do need, ideally, a good attorney or local title agent that can do generally just a quick check. I mean, there's no point in paying hundreds of dollars for a full check on every property because you get so few of them. But the public records are pretty easy to read. And nowadays, and again, that's something that wasn't available 5, 6 years ago, but now you can type in the name of the property owner and you can see a whole history of all the mortgages, when they're repaid, all the liens, all the other debts, the lis pendens, you can see the divorces, death certificates. There's a whole ton of stuff you can see. It is worth training yourself how to do it. I'm able to do it myself now, and I do it myself a lot of the time, but I relied on title agents to do it for me at the beginning. And then when we were doing a bit more scale, like buying multiple houses every month, we had an attorney that just did them for us. And they would come back with the feedback saying, this is clean, you're good to go. Or there's an unpaid utility bill or an unpavement assessment. So you just adjust your numbers accordingly.
This is pretty fascinating. Clearly something that's not for beginners. This is advanced real estate entrepreneurship here that we're talking about, buying property at a foreclosure auction. And I can imagine that in your learning process, you've made quite a few mistakes. Tell us real quickly about a few of those embarrassing mistakes, tough lessons. I mean, this is really the school of hard knock stuff here.
I've made a lot of mistakes and it's hard to avoid them. Anybody that's bought 100 properties, I'm sure will happily admit to loads of mistakes. And this is not the same as buying a house from the MLS where you get a property inspector to look at it and you have a title agent making sure everything's squeaky clean. And the only mistake you can make is with your renovation budget, or your after repair value. This is a whole different thing. So previous mistakes I made in the early days and even the not so early days. One was not noticing huge utility liens. And you might think, your water bill might be $100 a month or something like that. But when a house has been vacant for years, those bills can go into the thousands of dollars. I've had utility bills north of $4,000 that I didn't know about until after I tried to get utilities connected after I bought it. So that's not nice.
That becomes your responsibility then.
Yeah, I mean, the water company won't turn the water on until you pay the previous bill. So yeah, you're kind of they got you cornered. And some of them will negotiate with you. Some of them will give you a discount if you ask them, but most don't. I've had $3,000 water bills and I've had them say, well, we'll knock $50 off it. And that's all they're doing. They know I'm an investor. They know I need water to renovate and sell that house.
They know they got you.
They got you. So you need to be careful about that. And if a house has been vacant for years and you see a utility bill, just assume it's a couple of $1,000s. And, if you're pleasantly surprised, then all the better. I've had roof permits wrong where I've seen a roof permit for 2018 and I might think, okay, this roof is good. I don't need to replace it. But the roof permit was just for a minor repair of $1,000 and the roof was actually 15 years old. Even though it might look okay, it's 15 years old with maybe a 16-year lifespan. So that was adding another $8,000 onto your renovation budget because I didn't take that into account. Sometimes it can take a long time to get possession of a property if it's occupied and the owners have good legal counsel. So your money is kind of spent the same day, as we talked about earlier, but you can be in limbo for months. Literally for months and months and months if they're fighting it because you're not getting clean title, you're not getting access to the house. And sometimes the court will rule in their favor and cancel the foreclosure and they end up just sending you back your money 4 months later, minus thousands of dollars in court fees. And you've got nothing to show for it other than having put your money in an escrow account for 4 months and paid money to do it. So that's a huge pain, as you can probably imagine.
Because you couldn't get that borrower to vacate the property. You couldn't get possession. They fought.
Yeah, they fought, couldn't get clean title, and it was just held up while my lawyer, who I had to pay, was fighting their lawyer to see if the foreclosure was valid or not. Gosh. And sometimes, and I've no problem with this, everybody's entitled to fight for their own property. I can't argue against that, but every now and again that happens. Generally, if the house is vacant, nobody's going to fight the foreclosure. But if it's an owner-occupier situation, they might, and you need to be prepared for that. And it's quite painful having your capital tied up like that. Thankfully, that didn't happen to us in the early days. It just happened to us when we had a little bit more volume and we were able to kind of absorb it a little bit easier. The most annoying one is when you have this great property, you've done all your homework on it, you know your bid price, I'm going to bid $100,000 for this property, but you don't have enough money in escrow, that you've only got $4,000 in escrow, which means you can only bid to $80,000 instead of $5,000 because you maybe bought a property 2 days ago, which depletes your escrow balance and you forgot to top it up again. It's incredibly frustrating that you've done all the work and all your colleagues have done all the work to prepare you to bid on this property, but then you don't have the money to bid on it. And then the obvious one, just paying too much because of adrenaline. You're just chasing a property further than you should be. You're overpaying for it. And then you're just trying to make up for it the whole way through. You're trying to say, well, do I really need a new kitchen or do I really need to replace this 15-year-old AC? It's just not worth the hassle and the stress. There's a lot of mistakes you can make, but it's a very good way of getting inventory. It's that you can get properties at a discount, but they're still competitive. Obviously, there's a lot of people doing this.
Yeah, this is the school of self-education rather than formal education here, scooping up properties at foreclosure auctions. Well, this has been really fascinating to learn about, Colin. I did as much learning or more than some of my listeners because this is a world that was previously unfamiliar to me, but you're an expert in more things than just foreclosure auctions. So tell our audience more about you.
I've done a lot of fix and flips over the years. I'm a very curious person by nature. I love real estate. I like a buy and hold guy. I like lending to wholesalers. I enjoy purchasing in tax deeds and tax liens, flipping properties, buying in foreclosures, buying from wholesalers. I enjoy talking about it. I have a podcast, colinpodcast.com is the website, or Colin Podcast About Real Estate is the name of the show. I just love the freedom real estate gives me. I've invested in US real estate for about 10 years. A lot of that was from being based overseas. And I just love the freedom real estate gives you. That passive income it generates, your ability even to generate active income remotely is easier now than ever before. And the pandemic has just accelerated the development of those tools. I do write reports from time to time. I have a website, finally, which you can visit. It's called colininvestments.com, COLIN. Investments.com. You'll find videos, podcasts, reports.
Colininvestments.com. Colin Murphy, thanks so much for educating us here on the show.
Thank you, Keith.
Well, you got to see what risks providers really have to take, even experienced ones. You also see why turnkey providers, they need loans from private lenders because they need to pay all cash same day for these properties. A foreclosure moratorium has kept a ceiling on the number of foreclosures lately. It should increase somewhat once that ends. And of course, this is exactly why renovated property providers have low inventory right now. I do not directly rehab any property. We create value here instead by only purchasing in investor advantage markets where we expect cash flow on day one. Right now, rather than rehabbing property, think about the opportunity that you have to rehab your financing. That's what you can do right now to increase your cash flow on your existing properties. Think of refinancing as what you're doing then is rehabbing your financing for up to 70% or 80% of the value of your property. Great stuff from Colin today for helping us deep dive into a rehabbed property's backstory at the auctions. Next week here on the show, a year-end recap of some crucial can't-miss housing and finance stories. Also, another great in-house chat as Andrea and I discuss goals and your mindset about setting new goals for the year in a way that you've never thought about before. Until next week, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.